Welcome to this new episode of Papa PhD. Today, I have the pleasure of having with me Kira Dineen. Kira has a master's in genetic counseling and a decade of podcast experience fueled by a passion for science communication. She has hosted and produced 5 podcasts. Her main show, DNA Today, is in the top 1.5% of podcasts globally. In it, listeners discover new advances in the world of genetics through Kira's interviews about genetic technology, disorders, and news. The show has produced over 180 episodes with over 320,000 downloads, and I know that may mean nothing to you, the listener, but it's a lot, and has won the best 2020 and 2021 Science and Medicine Podcast Awards. First, congratulations, and second, welcome to Papa PhD, Kira.
Thank you, David. Yeah, it's great being here. I've listened to a couple of your episodes, the English one, since I unfortunately don't speak French. But yeah, you have a great show, so I was really happy when you invited me on.
Yes, we met at an event by the Podcast Academy, and there's a mentorship structure there, and we kind of met in one of those. And once I saw DNA Today, I was like, I need to talk to her. And I'm super happy to have you here. It's super impressive to see you've been podcasting for over 10 years. It's considering when podcasts were born, it's been a while.
Yeah, a good chunk of my life.
Yeah, right. Of course, one of the reasons why I'm also super excited you're here is because you're a scientist. You have you have the masters in genetic counseling that you've done. And that actually, we're going to talk about that. That's going to be one of the axes that we're going to follow. Which has to do with applying to graduate school, etc., etc. I know you have some golden nuggets to share of yours about that. But also, one of the things that I find it very inspiring is how much science communication has become a part of your day-to-day, a part of how you interact with science, with even your domain of research. And I'm really, really curious to kind of pick your brain and ask you how it has, how doing a podcasting has affected your evolution, even within your domain of interest and of work and of research.
So, and the spoiler is it has influenced me a lot.
There you go. All right. Well, maybe to start, I gave a really short and very podcast-focused intro of you. For people who are listening or watching and would like to know a little better about who Kira is, what's one thing you would add to that list to present yourself a little bit more in depth?
Well, since I'm on this show, I feel like I should give a disclaimer. I do not have my PhD. So I went through grad school, but I got a master's. So a little bit different there. But yeah, I find genetics to be super interesting. And I just, as you said, like have a passion for science communications. And I've used podcasting as a way to build my career. And it's now a big chunk of my career. So, just being a genetic counselor, I think that's the other piece of it. So I help patients understand their genetics so that they can make informed healthcare decisions, help them with genetic testing. So that's kind of what my career is like.
Mm-hmm. And I want to kind of share that I've been on the other side of what you do. Someone in my partner's family had Lou Gehrig's, and so eventually we there's always a possibility of there being a hereditary aspect to it. And so I think we were with a colleague of yours here in Montreal. Eventually we discovered that no, in our case it wasn't the case, because we kind of were worried for our kids, but I'm sure first I think it's a very I'm going to say it like this because I went into biology a lot because of genetics, and I think it's very cool. It's the first thing that I was going to say. And I'm sure at times taxing or emotionally taxing or, not so easy to do, and noble. And for that reason, noble to do at certain moments what you do and to help people understand maybe what they're going through, the mechanisms of what they're going through, the repercussions, and helping them make decisions that can be very difficult to make without counseling and alone. So
Yeah, I think
I
that's well said, and it's definitely as interesting as genetics is. It's very hard when you're talking to patients, and it is, a case where there's a high risk for a genetic condition to be there. I work in pregnancy, so that's like my area. But in grad school, we did training in a lot of different areas of genetics, and
Mhm.
it definitely can be tough. I mean, sometimes when I'm meeting with patients, they're like, "This is the hardest thing I've ever experienced in my life," and like the hardest decisions of having to make there. Um, and it's those cases that you remember. It's those
Of course.
patients of being able to help them through that. So as challenging as it is in the moment, that's what I'm remembering, and that's when I feel like, wow, I'm making an impact on this person's life, as opposed to
Mhm.
everything looks great, everything's normal, good luck, like see it for the next pregnancy, maybe. So it's
Yeah.
definitely, very different kind of
Mhm.
sessions there.
Yeah. In any case, I always find it impressive people who end up choosing a job where they have such a direct impact on actual people's lives, and actually and have eventually to deal with people's emotions on their day to day. So anyway, thanks for what you do. Now, actually a question that stems directly from that, because yes, it's called Papa PhD. The show is called Papa PhD, but I've had different guests who've done their master. So grad school is basically the kind of the frontier that I'm kind of putting between just a bachelor's and graduate school. And then often some people even start a PhD and end up finding out it's not for them, and they keep their masters and go with that, which I have by some reports has some advantages, some financial advantages, but
Certainly
that can be
does. Yeah.
be for another conversation. Where I was going is a master's in genetic counseling the requirement or a requirement to become a genetic counselor?
Yeah, so I can speak to the US and Canada, which I'd
Please do.
imagine is probably most of your listener base.
Definitely is.
So in both countries, in order to be a certified genetic counselor, you need to have graduated from one of the 40 plus programs that we have. In Canada has about 4 programs, and the rest are in the US.
Okay.
So the US has a lot more than Canada. So like in my class, we had 5 Canadians, just because I was in New York, so it's just like, okay,
It's
apply to
close.
the New York schools. Yeah, definitely for people, in Ottawa and Toronto and like that whole area. But yeah, so having a master's in genetics and like human genetics, that's the terminal degree right now in genetic counseling.
Okay.
So there is no PhD in genetic counseling, but maybe years from now, someone will be listening to this and be like, now there is, right? So
Yeah.
that could change. Maybe we'll be grandfathered in. Who knows?
Mhm.
Fingers crossed. But yeah, for now, this is the terminal degree. That being said, some people go on to get their PhD in genetics or something that's like an adjacent,
Of
or
course.
something that can go with it. But yeah, so that's kind of how genetic counseling is a little bit different. So you don't have to do as much training as doctors and other different types of careers in healthcare.
Hmm. And it's targeted towards that career. Can I ask you what your bachelor's was before?
Sure, yeah. So since high school, I knew I wanted to do something in genetics. So
Hmm.
I went for an undergrad degree it's officially called diagnostic genetics,
Okay. Applied.
diagnostic genetic
Kind of.
sciences. Yep. So I focus on cytogenetics, so looking at like chromosomes.
Yes.
So doing karyotypes. That's what I was doing for like 2 years. Lots and lots of karyotypes. So yeah, that's what I focused on in undergrad. That was very particular. There's only like a couple programs in the country. I happened to be at a school that had a program. So that was kind of just fate that happened. But a lot of people that go on to genetic counseling school have come from a variety of different backgrounds. I think the
Okay.
most common is biology and psychology. But one of my roommates came from like more of like a criminal law background, which like you
Oh
wouldn't
wow.
expect, right? So as long as you have those core classes, the genetics classes, the psychology classes, like some chem classes,
Mm.
then you can apply. So you could be like a dance major or anything really, as long as you have those core classes.
The
And
core. It makes
yeah.
sense. It
And I
makes
think it's
sense.
interesting coming from a different background because, the roommate that I mentioned, Ashlyn Anokian, so she ended up being my partner for our thesis project. And
Okay.
so we ended up doing a thesis project that was related to law. So that was really helpful to have her
Wow.
as my partner, right? So she could explain all of that to me, because I don't know law. Now I know a little
Of
bit more.
course.
But
That's
yeah,
super cool.
it's nice to hear from people that come from different backgrounds. So I think it's certainly advantageous to have like a unique background.
Hmm. And like you mentioned at the beginning, the applications, vary of this type of your type of knowledge. It's not only pregnancies; it can be rare diseases. But I imagine criminology also. I can see how having a karyotype, matching another one can solve a problem.
Right. So
Anyway.
we had like the Golden State Killer a few years ago out of like California. So they were identified based on DNA testing and like through like relatives. So there's
Hmm.
certainly, and that I'm sure we'll hear more and more cases of that. So there's
Hmm.
just, you think of something, I'm sure there's a genetic like job available within that in
Yeah.
a healthcare space. Yeah.
Awesome. So again, for anyone who's listening and wants to go that way, I think Kira just shared a little bit of the blueprint of what to do, and the masters is kind of the key to get there. Now, you said you've shared with us that you've been interested in genetics generally for a while, but then there must have been a moment, by the end of your bachelor's, where you started thinking about, okay, what's the next step and what do I need to do to get to the next step? Do you remember that time? Did you have different choices, or was like genetic counseling like the main focus from day one?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think it was late high school for me when I was trying to figure out like, okay, I know I want to do genetics. That was locked in. But like, okay, what does a career in genetics look like? What are my options? Like, I think a lot of people right away think, okay, lab, like do research. And that was interesting to me, but I was like, I don't know if that's going to hold me, because there's not a big communication aspect on a daily basis with working in
Hmm.
research. And I mean, I have a podcast. I love talking. I love communicating with the public and teaching and educating. So I didn't think that would work out for me. I don't think I had like the patience for the research. So I started looking at other careers. And my mom is a social worker. So I grew up
Okay.
with, that influence. And like she has always loved her career, and just loved her interactions with clients. So I was like, okay, I really like this, but it's not nerdy enough for me. So then my mom actually discovered genetic counseling. She's like, I found your career. And I'm like, okay, what is it this time?
That's so funny.
And she was like, genetic counselor, you can basically do what I do, but it's more nerdy. It's like got that whole genetics angle that you were looking for. And I was like,
I love it.
okay, let's look into this. So I think it was like end of high school when I found genetic counseling. And there was definitely moments where I was like, do I want to go into genetic counseling? Like, is every day going to be really sad? Like, is my, just,
Mm.
a lot of our life is working, especially in Canada and the US, like the cultures that we're in. And I did worry about that for a couple months. I was like, I don't know. I really questioned if I wanted to go into the career.
Hmm.
But then I came to the realization that patients are going to be going through these experiences, whether I'm there or not. So either I can be there to help them through it, or I'm not. So, it's not something that, I'm causing any of this, right?
Hmm.
But I just have the opportunity to educate them and support them through what can be really hard times. So I think once I took that perspective on and was able to shadow genetic counselors, I was like, okay, I can really see myself doing this now. That, depending on what type of job you have in the field, some days are going to be sad, and then other days are, more normal, neutral, even upbeat.
Hmm.
So I think it really, really depends. But that's kind of like the roller coaster of what I went through in order
Yeah,
to be
yeah,
like,
yeah.
okay, genetic counseling, let's do it.
So that's kind of lucky because a lot of us uh, takes time, and anyway, there's different things on the plate, and we don't it might be difficult to choose. You seem that with the help of your mom, it's just awesome how it happened that you kind of found your thing, and I think it's a blessing in a way. But so you knew what you wanted to do, and because what I would like to bring in this episode is how parallel looking for a graduate school and a position, for a master's in your case, in a graduate school, has parallels with looking for a job in a specific company or corporation or organization of any kind. And I'd really like to hear if there was some sort of strategy to how first you went through bachelor's, second, you established connections, maybe did some networking even during your bachelor's years, and then how you kind of what sort of like personal branding, let's say, strategies you used to pose yourself as the best candidate for a place in that or that graduate program.
Yeah, I think that's a really good prompt because networking to me is huge. I think that's one of the most important things in your career. I didn't have stellar grades in undergrad. I tried my best. I'm someone that has to study a lot to get the grades of other people. So sometimes I'd have roommates in college. They're like, "Oh, I can just study a couple hours for an exam." I'm like, "Couple hours? I'm studying all weekends. Like, I'm just taking meal and sleep breaks." I'm not someone that I consider to be like a brainiac, just raw brain talent and just getting things and it sticks in your brain. So I knew I had to compensate in other areas. So to be very transparent, my GPA was, let's say GP, like general practitioner, GPA was 3.2 in college. So
Okay.
it was fine, but it wasn't like, wow, like 3.9, 4.0. So I really focused on, as you said, like personal branding. So I did a lot of networking. A lot was through my podcast. So just being able to talk to people at my university at undergrad and say, okay, can I interview you for the show? And then it's like, oh, once I interviewed them, they're like, do you want to work in my lab? And I'm like, yes,
Mhm.
I would love that. So just getting involved and making those connections early on. So I think when I was a sophomore, I was working in a genetics lab. And really just working under like a research assistant. So I was even, below that. So I
Mhm.
was more just like learning from him and seeing like, okay, we were doing karyotypes and doing cell cultures. And so just learning a lot of those basics. And I found it really helpful because then I knew a lot more going into my genetics program, which was junior and senior year. The first 2 years were like, those common core classes,
Of course.
gen eds and
Yeah.
all that. So I found that to be really helpful because once I had those connections, I think that's also what helped me even get into my genetic undergrad program because I think in my, there was 12 of us about, and I think I had the lowest GPA. So I'm like, I think they, maybe that was a big part of it. Like, Kira's super
Mhm.
motivated and she wants to be here. She may not be the top of the class, but she really wants to be here. She wants to be, making a career for herself.
Mhm.
So I think just showing that like you're passionate and you're very resourceful with the people you're meeting and figuring out like, oh, who do they know that they could introduce me to, and how is a way that I can either help them and like say, hey, do you need an intern? Do you need any extra help with anything? I think people, millennials, Gen Z, I'm kind of right on the line there. Um, offering like to companies and different organizations, can I help with your social media? Because
Mhm.
oftentimes it's older people doing it and they may not be as well versed in it. And
Yeah.
that's a skill set that, most people have that are on the young side. So I think really just taking advantage of whatever you have access to. That was my big thing and how I think I've gotten to where I am today.
It's really interesting, and what it makes me think of is, you know, when you go when you kind of apply for a position and you send your CV, the CV is kind of like your is it GPA that you said?
Right. GPI.
Yeah, a CV is like a GPA. You're kind of two dimensional. It's a piece of paper that really doesn't show your depth. And by finding a way, in your case, it was having this podcast and interviewing people. And when you interview, establish relationships, you have conversations. There's an exchange of different things. People see your body language, they feel your energy. You came from this like maybe unidimensional being, which was your grades, to becoming a three-dimensional one who, oh well, she's so interesting and she's so dynamic and she's so interested. And then the importance, kind of the ponderation of that grade started being lower and lower versus the whole reality of you as a burgeoning scientist in that case. And I think there's a great parallel to make in when you're looking for a job, which is your CV is just one thing that if it's the only thing you send out, you're going to be compared to other CVs and it's just going to be numbers. So there's a lot of I tried to, and I just gave a workshop on personal branding for scientists wanting to either get a job in academia or out of it. And it's a lot about showing your other dimensions. I really, really, I think your example illustrates that so well.
Yeah, I think it's important just to be able to utilize like the network you have and grow that network, because I think about, I've had different clients over the years and jobs, and the vast majority of them have been through networking. When
Hmm.
I've just applied to jobs through like LinkedIn Jobs or Monster or Indeed, like all of those, like you very rarely hear back. You could be the best candidate, but like there's just so many people putting it in. Whereas if you know someone that knows the hiring manager, you get that personal introduction, like that's how it happens. So I think that's just so important. And I wish there was more of a focus of that, like in undergrad. Like my experience of this was just, going out, like fake it until you make it kind of thing. Like I'm just going to keep trying. Right. And even now, like I reach out to guests all the time, and, famous scientists, I never hear back, but I'm like, well, what if they say yes? I'm just going to put myself out there.
That's true.
It's kind of like dating. Like you just have to get used to, the like, nope, we're just declining that. Nope. The
Yeah.
rejection there. And say, all right, well,
I tried.
just go for it. Yeah. Like what's the worst? They say no. All right, move on. So I think, yeah, the networking is just so important.
Hmm.
And that's what I think how you can build a career. And just thinking about like who knows who, and who do you want to talk to? How are you going to get there?
Hmm.
Can you find a way, like, a web of people of saying, okay, I know this person, they know this person, and just keep working it.
Hmm. And I guess in undergrad, it's really a lot about finding out where the labs are and finding the one that you'd like to work in and try to offer your help doing whatever under like you said, like a lab assistant or whatever, but just show your face there, show your interest and help. And I think that goes a long ways to getting people to know you, and to then think of you if an opportunity arises, or to ask for your help if there's a new project. I agree.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Now, what about the nitty gritty or do you have any advice on actually the mechanics or the mechanistics of getting into a program? Because there's bureaucracy, there's different things, there's timelines, there's deadlines. Do you have any advice on that side?
Yes, I think hopefully I have good advice. It's so involved. I mean, I can only speak to the genetic counseling, application process for grad school, but I think a lot of it applies to other grad schools as well, especially in that
Hmm.
science space. It's a long process because throughout undergrad, you're hopefully working towards beefing up that resume, that CV that we've been talking about, and setting yourself up to be a good applicant. And then when it comes to summer, so that's, summer, like for some people it's senior year. For me, it was the year after because I took a gap year. Um, Summer is when I started writing my personal statement because I wanted ample time to be able to make it perfect, or
Hmm.
as close to perfect as I could get it. So I really took the summer to write, rewrite, throw it out, complete, just like write so many times, so many drafts, and had a lot of people read it. So, started with like family and friends reading it, giving me feedback, saying, don't hold back, like this has to be good. And then passing it along to genetic counselors that I had shadowed with, saying, hey, you're in this space. Like, do you mind reading my personal statement and giving me feedback? Like, is there anything that you feel like is missing, or did I get anything wrong, genetics, right? Because I don't want to do
Hmm.
that. So, I think having someone that's, sort of a mentor, or someone that you've had that is in the position that you want to be in, read your personal statement is the best.
Hmm.
Now it's come full circle. Now I read applicants' personal statements if they're looking for any advice and seeing, if they're on the right track. But yeah, I found that to be really helpful. Um, and then it's like actually going through and like applying to all of the programs that you want to.
Hmm.
For me, I applied to 7 programs. I wanted to stay in like the New York area. I didn't want to go too far. And lucky for me, there is a lot of programs in this area. But that's not necessarily the case, certainly in Canada, and other parts of the US. So I think figuring out like what schools you want to apply to and what's going to be a good match for you. Um, and what we have is the match system. Have you heard of the match system?
No, no, go ahead.
So what the match system is basically you apply to all of these schools, and if you get an interview at that school, then you rank them. So for me, it wasn't just it was 7 schools, but it was multiple tracks of
Okay.
ranking because some of the schools might have a scholarship track or something, right? So I'm like, okay, I'm going to rank the scholarship track earlier than the normal admission track because I want to get a scholarship, right? So
Of
you want to
course. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
maximize your chances there. So I was the first year of the match program. So I enrolled in 2018. So basically, you rank the schools, they rank you after interviews. And then it goes into this, to make it simple, goes into this
Mhm.
black box with this algorithm. And then on match day, which is usually late April, then it's announced who are the students at each program. So you
Mhm.
get an email that's like, okay, you either matched or you didn't match. And if you did match, then what school have you matched with? So the old school way of doing it was like you would just get a bunch of schools that you got into, and then you'd have to contact them and say, okay, yes, I'll accept.
I'll take it. Hmm.
Right. And that was quite a mess from what I hear from, peers that are a little older than me. So now I think it's a much better process. I was definitely nervous going into it because I was like, oh, I feel like I have less control, right? They're just going to tell me
Yeah, the
where to
random
go.
aspect. Yeah.
Yeah. But I think when it comes down to it, like you're ranking the schools and the student it favors the student over the schools, which I think is a
Okay.
good thing. So certainly, like I tell applicants, don't rank a school if you don't want to go to them because you could,
Mhm.
even if it's the last on your list. But I think, once you kind of learn about the match system, I think it is a good program and a good setup. Um, and I think it takes a lot of the stress out of like being waitlisted and figuring out, okay, am I going to get into the school? And like just, a lot of
Yeah. It
confusion
could
and more emotions there.
could be
Um,
nerve-wracking. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So that's kind of like the overview of how it works. So you kind of start in summer, hopefully writing your personal statement. You're submitting your applications usually around December. You'll get interview invitations, I would say like February, early March.
Okay.
Do those interviews March, possibly early April. Submit your rank list middle of April, and then end of April, that's match day when everybody finds
Okay.
out. So that's like the overview of it. So it is a long process, as you said.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. And now, let's say for because this personal statement aspect of it is not something that exists everywhere. I it may exist some place in Europe, but where I come, like in Portugal, I don't remember anything that resembles it. Maybe some programs do have it, but can you, for people who haven't heard about this, can you know explain it a little bit what goes into a personal statement?
Yeah.
Uh,
And this is for a lot of grad programs. Like I know other friends and family that have applied to grad schools that wrote a personal statement as well that are not in the genetic space.
mhm.
So with a personal statement, I like thinking of it like a way to really let your personality and passion shine through. So, where your resume is just like a list of what you've done, your personal statement is bringing stories and making it come to life. So, you don't want to just restate your resume in like an essay format. That doesn't fly. That doesn't help you. So, in a personal statement, I think it's really about pulling out what are experiences that you've had that will make you a good whatever you're applying to. So for me, a good genetic counselor, like what skills do I have that I want to develop further in grad school? Um, what are skills that I admire in other genetic counselors that I want to learn? And really just saying like how you are committed to this field and you really want to do this and be there. Because part of it is financial, right? Schools want to make
Mhm.
sure that you're going to stick with the program and not drop out because that
Mhm. Yeah.
spot, depending on how the program's set up, may not be able to be filled halfway through.
Of course.
So I know that's the case in genetic counseling. You can't fill it halfway through. So I think that's part of it. Overall, I think the programs are really looking for, we want a really strong alumni network. So we
Of
want to have
course.
students that are really interested in this field and that are going to go out there and represent our program in a great, light.
Mhm.
So I think it's really about showing this is the skills I have, this is what I want to work on, and this is why I want to be, for me, like a genetic counselor.
Mhm.
So more talking about experiences throughout that highlight all of that. So pulling out like an experience that I had like from being a camp counselor at a grief camp, instead of just saying I did this, I talked about an experience I had with one of the campers, talked about a genetic counseling session that really stuck with me, and that where I admired how the genetic counselor handled the whole situation from that counseling perspective, and say, I want to go to grad school because I want to be able to do that. Obviously in better words than that. You want to be more eloquent than I'm being right now, but really just show like, I want to do this.
Okay, so there's a strong aspect of storytelling. How long is it supposed to be?
It's usually like a page, maybe a page and a half. Like, yeah, I remember like for one of them, I think it was like 750 characters or something, like very short, or words, probably not characters. That would be very short. But yeah, so it's hard to make it that short. So you have to pack a lot.
It's kind of an elevator pitch for yourself in letter form. That's super interesting, and again, great parallel to the job market, where
where you're writing a cover letter, right?
Yeah, exactly.
It's kind of the same thing as a cover letter. Like, maybe cover letter is a little different, where you're focusing more on how that job you're going to be do a good job in that role. But a lot of parallels.
Yeah, and there's a job posting, so you have some terminology that you want to use in the cover letter, versus here you're really drawing on your experience and on what you think is going to make you a good candidate for that program. But it's super interesting, but it really, I think, comes back to the importance of doing some networking before, because if you've just been like going to classes and taking tests, what stories will you have to tell?
Right.
So I really find this interesting. I think it's a very kind of eye-opening message of if you wanna differentiate yourself or come out of the pack in a certain way. Well, you have to expect that people will want you to tell stories, and to have the stories, the work has to start way earlier.
Yeah.
This is also, go ahead.
I was just going to say it definitely is very important if you can shadow. So whatever you're going for in terms of a career, I think it's really important to shadow and be able to see, okay, what does that look like on a day-to-day basis? Because in your mind, you might be like, wow, that's really cool, I want to do that. And then once you go to shadow, you're like, oh my goodness, this is not what I want to do. That's really useful information to say, okay, I don't want to do this, right? So when I worked in a lab, I was like, this is really cool and interesting, and I'm so glad I did that. And now in my job, it's really great that I've done all of this, because I'm ordering the testing that I used to do. So for me, it's really helpful because patients ask me questions, I can answer them because I used to do that testing. So that's really helpful. But even through that experience, it validated me that I'm like, I want to be a genetic counselor. I don't want to be working in the lab. That's just not who I am. And that was really helpful. So even to count out different, branches of careers, say, okay, I'm not necessarily a bench person. Because what if I loved it and I was like, you know what, scratch genetic counseling, I want to do lab work.
Yeah, could be.
It's really good. And sometimes it can be hard to be able to actually shadow a person, especially with, COVID and HIPAA. So what I recommend is contact someone and just like buy them a coffee and just chat about, what is your day-to-day work? What do you hate about your job? What do you love about your job? And just do one of those, like what we call informational interviews. Because I find that to be really helpful. I definitely did a lot of those.
I kind of wish I had gone through my bachelor's the way you went through yours. so proactive, and you're really applying anything that I usually tell people in grad school to think about getting their job. You're hitting all the marks.
Right. Start doing it as early as you can, right?
Informational interviews are so important.
Yes.
But one of the things I think is, you clearly anyway, the impression I have from this interaction with you and interactions before is, and you do have a podcast and you have this energy in your voice, that you have this ease of approaching people, and not everyone does. People coming from I come from Portugal, but people coming from other cultures may have even less. May have this maybe difficulty in approaching authority that might preclude them from thinking if they're doing their bachelor's, let's say in the US, of thinking, I can approach the prof and ask them if they have a project I can help in. do you have a word of advice for people who might be a little bit more reserved or a little bit more shy about just approaching a prof? And what was your experience, approaching them? And did you get rejected, or
Yes.
I don't know. I'm thinking of someone to who this makes sense, but they're like, yeah, but I don't know,
Right, of just, like, having the courage to, like, go up and do it, or, like, finding your
because
wording
it's
and just,
so
like, socially
important.
how to approach that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, and I have to say, like, in high school, I hated public speaking. Like, I'm one of those people that in
Okay.
high school, I
Hmm.
would dread it. Like, I'd have some kind of presentation in a class, like, a month away, and I'm just like, "Oh, I can't believe that has to happen in a month," like, counting down the days, dreading it. And I think it's just like a lot of other things in life where it's like the more you do it, the easier it is. So I used to, for years, would get nervous before interviews, on my podcast. And now I'm just like, oh, okay, yep, next interview, because I've done so many of them, right? So I think it's
Yeah.
just like anything, like riding a bike. It's like once you've got it, you're like, okay, you can pick up that bike 15 years later, you'll still be able to ride it. You have that muscle
Hmm.
memory, right? So I think it's similar to that. And I think the way I started when I was in that more like nervous and like, not confident in myself. I think when I was in that phase of my life and just figuring out like who I am and all of that, I think most of us go through middle school, high school, early college. Um, sometimes it's hard to talk to someone in person. So it's like maybe shoot them an email and say, hey, I really respect you and I love the research you've done or whatever, right? Like the book they wrote, the art they've done, like whatever it applies. And saying like, could we set up like a meeting right after class? Like, could I talk to you after class? That way, like there's a plan in place and you're not just going up to them saying, hey, do you have a couple minutes? And then they're like packing up their bag and you're like, all right, now I don't want to do this next class, right? So I think maybe having that approach,
That's a
that
good
certainly
idea.
helped me. So I was like, okay, I know that I'm going to approach them next class at the end because they said they'd talk to me for a couple minutes, right?
Hmm.
So I think having some kind of plan and just saying like, oh, I want to talk to you about this, or like to see if there's any opportunities in your lab, or to be a TA for your class next semester or year.
Hmm.
So that definitely helped me as I got started. And then I was like, okay, I'm getting the hang of this. Like then you can
Of
kind of put
course.
yourself out there more.
That makes a lot of sense, and it's true. It's an easy way to ease yourself in, and my experience with informational interviews is that people either often they're busy, they might not answer, but most of the times they're really happy to help. And I don't know if it's been your experience too, but at work, the worst case scenario, they'll say, "Sorry, I'm busy, I can't." What, there's no problem in that, and they
Right.
might even remember you later on and say, hey, you know what, this week I have time, if they were interested in talking with you. So I think taking that chance of shooting an email, it's not high stakes,
Right.
and the gain could be really high in the end.
Yeah, and I know in some cases, like if a student reaches out to me and they're not local to me, sometimes
Hmm.
I'll know of a genetic counselor that is in their area where I'm like, we can do a Zoom call, but if you
Hmm.
want to actually shadow in person and see sessions with patients, I have a colleague out in whatever, like Portland or something, where like,
Okay.
let me introduce you. I don't know if she's available, but let's give it a try, right? So I
Of
think that
course.
too, where it's like, or if I'm really busy and I'm like, I don't have any time until the end of the summer, whatever it is, but I have this colleague that I know might have some time. So you never know where you might end up, by reaching out to just that first person.
Hmm. That's a really great point, because like the name networking, it's a network, so often people will even recommend someone else if they're not, like you said, if they can't, or if they don't feel they're the right person to answer. It's a great point. Kira, we're approaching the end of the interview, but one thing I really wanted to talk about, and I think we can finish on this, is you've mentioned that you were doing a podcast even during your bachelor's, and off the mic, you kind of told me, and we kind of mentioned it at the beginning too, that going into science communication, in particular, through podcasting, that it has had a positive impact on your career. Is it something that you think can be generalized to any type of science communication, in your opinion?
Yeah, I definitely think so. I think there's, certainly a lot of people are now starting podcasts, and that's something that's more common nowadays. Um, but I think there's so many different types of media where you can get your feet wet. Even just writing articles, blog posts. I know I've done, quite a bit of that in my career as well. And just working on those communication skills. I think that made my adjustment from graduating from grad school to working that much easier, because I had been working on these communication skills, and it was much easier for me. Like in my job, I have to explain genetics to patients. That's what I do all day. So having the podcast, that's what I also do. So being able to develop all those skills made it so much easier to graduate, and start working right away. And, certainly you still have the imposter syndrome. I know I've heard that mentioned on other episodes of your show. And it's getting through that. But I think the more exposure that you've had and the more experience is making that easier. So all jobs have some form of communication to them. So I think it's really important to, try it out. There's certainly a lot of, podcasts that are looking for guests to come on to talk about different topics. Blog posts are always looking for additional content, social media. So there's just so many different ways that you can get involved in terms of not only getting involved in your field, but also starting to work on those communication skills, because then I feel like it's just so much easier to start working, because there's enough of a learning curve once you start working. I think there's like the 3 months and then the 6 months. And then, for me after that, I felt more like, okay, I've got a good handle on this job. But, for that first bit, I think everybody's just experiencing like, okay, I got my degree, but I don't know how to actually do this job. Right. So I think there's always, a bit of a transition there. But I think the more experience you can do ahead of time can really, really help with that and make you more confident. I think that's the big part of it too, that I think I went into my job with more confidence because of that.
So there's something you said I want to pick up, but there's another aspect that I feel also, and tell me if you agree, that you get from doing the podcast, which is you're keeping in contact first with the research, with what's new and fresh in the domain, even with scientists, because you're interviewing them. So for you, there's kind of a constant refresher of what's happening in the space, in your space, right?
Yeah, because, I graduated in 2020. So I consider myself a recent grad. I don't know how long I can keep saying that, but, the further I get away from grad school, I think the more important it is that I keep doing these interviews for myself, because I don't want to, just be in my prenatal realm and not keep up to a certain extent to cancer, neuro, pediatrics. So I want to be able to, have a gist of what's going on there. I'm certainly nothing close to an expert in those areas, but I want to know in general what's happening in those fields. And even within my own field, when I do interviews, I find it to be really helpful to like stay on top of it. Certainly going to conferences, like that stuff, is kind of built in careers to do. But I think when I'm doing an interview, I'm paying attention a little bit more than I do in conferences, because I'm forced to, right? Like I have to respond to people. I'm sure you feel like the same way, right?
But so the thing that you kind of alluded to, and that I kind of picked up on, and tell me if I understood well. You kind of said, maybe in different words, that you found that communication skills were extremely important to your ability to graduate. Did I hear right?
Yeah.
Oh my God! I want to start another interview just right now.
Part 2.
But I do agree with you. But can you expand a little bit on that? Because one of the things I always want to do is to motivate people to take on new habits that may be a little bit uncomfortable, but they will gain a lot by, and like you said, by starting them, and then by learning them, and then by becoming good at them with time. And it's the first time I kind of heard it the way you said it, but I think it makes a lot of sense. Can you expand a little bit on that?
Yeah, I think it's important to have those communication skills, because, just using myself as an example, like the job that I currently have as a genetic counselor, when I went into that interview, I was pretty nervous, right? Like this is my first, like, you could say like first salary, full-time adult job. I'm 25 at the time, I think. And so going into that, I think I wanted to show like I'm a good communicator. And so in order even just to get the job, I needed to be a good communicator, because what is the job? Pretty much science communications, right? Genetics. So I wanted to show, the doctor owns the practice. So I wanted to show him like, hey, I'm going to be good at this job. Like, I want to show you that I'm really good in this interview.
Mhm.
So I think even that was really important. And then once starting the job, just being able to have those skills, not only to talk with the doctor that I work for and to be able to communicate effectively, but also with patients and to be able to like communicate and know that, okay, I'm doing this well, I'm getting my point across, so that I felt like, okay, I'm actually doing my job and like I'm
Mhm.
doing it well. Um, so I think that was like the biggest part for me was like, okay, I've done, at that point, like 8 years of the podcast and doing interviews. And I'm like,
Mhm.
all right, I'm going to channel all of those skills and hone them into this new job and just like transfer them. Because that's what I think made it so much easier because I there's not another genetic counselor at the practice I work at. I'm the only one.
Mhm.
So there wasn't another one to be like, oh, don't do it this way, do it that way. Like I had to check myself and be like,
Okay.
how did that go? Okay, like meeting with myself, right? Like, all right, do I think the patient understood everything? Is there something I should change? Is there ways that I could explain this better
Mhm.
analogies, So I think just having all of that is helpful. So I think like I can't imagine if I didn't have all of that mindset, those skills going into it, because I think the job would have been much more overwhelming.
Of course. Yeah. Yeah, and just thinking that you're going to be facing the public and the clients, etc. All just that can be a big obstacle to a lot of people.
Yeah.
But and what about it in grad school per se? Like, let's say you talked about working on a thesis with a colleague. Uh, what was the impact of your ease with communication on that final part of doing your masters?
Yeah. So I think the thesis is always like like the culmination of your grad program
Of
and
course.
everything for a lot of programs. So I think actually writing the thesis, I think writing is something that, I think even really great writers struggle with writing. It's just, always
It's part of the experience.
it's yeah, it's like, you kind of have this really bad first draft and like you just have to do it so then it can get better from there. So I think just having those writing skills helped me and just knowing like, okay, how have I written things in the past? For me, I start with an outline. Say, okay, this is what I want to cover. Like, this is my point. These are my subpoints. This is the articles I'm using for each one. And then transferring that into like, now I'm going to write this out. So it's not an outline anymore. So like, I know
Mhm.
that's my process for writing anything, whether it be my thesis project, a blog post, even prepping for podcast interviews. Like I just have the same system for everything. And I was lucky that my partner also writes in kind of the same way. And
Okay.
our writing
You have
style
the
is
same
very
system.
similar.
Hmm.
Yeah. So that really helped. But I think being able to like explain, because, this is like dense genetic information. We're talking about,
Yeah.
genetic links to schizophrenia. So it
Hmm.
was, and there was a whole law aspect to it that I mentioned too. But
Yeah. Yeah.
so I think being able to explain all of that was like, okay, like water it down, water it down. Like, what does this actually mean? Like, if I'm explaining this to my grandmother, will she understand what this means? She doesn't have a science
Hmm.
background. So, like, I use her as my example a lot. Like, if I'm explaining this to her, will she follow along?
Hmm.
And I've heard a lot of like use like a fourth grade reading level. Like, if a fourth grader would understand this, you've hit your goal.
Hmm.
So I think a lot of it is just like, okay, does this make sense? Working through that. But that was definitely, a big part of grad school for a
Hmm.
lot of people, just figuring out that thesis and like finally when you're done with it, you're like, oh my gosh,
So Kira, we're really reaching the end of the interview, sadly. But kind of the three like axes that I'm getting from our conversation, and that are really parallels between your experience and your message of getting into grad school from bachelor's versus what I usually talk about, which is going from grad school to a job, is the first like big one is that networking is important. And looking at how I went through my bachelor's, so I wish someone had told me this from day one. But I think it's super super important in both tracks, let's say. And one of the great tools of networking, you mentioned it, is informational interviews. Is don't be shy. Someone has a kind of a job that really looks, whose description is really interesting to you, or someone whose journey towards a position, you look at it like, wow, how did the person come from more or less what I do, and then go there, and then go to where they are. Reach out to those people. Mainly on LinkedIn, that's where I send people, because that's where everyone now is having these types of conversations. And you'll see a bunch of people just are so happy to give back and to think back on their time in grad school or in, or in university, and to help someone who's coming up the same path. So don't hesitate on that. So one, networking. Two, there's this aspect of, let's call it personal branding, but in your case, we talked specifically about science communication, because we're talking about staying still within this science track, and I think not everyone it has to be a podcaster, not everyone has to be a YouTuber, but one of the things everyone who's in grad school does, or in bachelor's, is write. So there's many things. You can have a Twitter account where you just give short bursts of whatever subject you're interested in. That you can have a blog if you even really like to write. There's many different things, and then of course you can go through the different media that we mentioned. What's interesting about that is it leaves a trace of your interest in a specific domain. It kind of shows more of you, again, to keep you from being that like one-dimensional candidate who is a number or a CV. If there's discourse that you have written, if there's prose, if there's art that you've made, it shows more of yourself. So you become kind of a tri-dimensional or multi-dimensional being that is much more, that someone who's trying to build a team is going to take much more from that information than what's just on your CV or on your GPA. And then the third one, and let's see if I'm able to kind of bring everything back in. The third one is the importance of communication and being able to, because you can think, and again, depending on the culture you come from, you might think, okay, I'm going to university, it's going to be me, the books, the pens, and the grades. But society is still happening outside, and life is still happening outside. So communicating and learning to communicate in whichever medium you prefer is going to be important, just not only for your personal branding or giving an image, but for the interactions you're going to have that might lead you into that position in a program or in a job. If you know how to structure ideas, if you know how to quickly pitch yourself or the project you're working on, it can help you so much in those first few conversations and can open doors. And I would say, that's, I don't know if you have one last thing to add or if there's something I missed, but for me, it's kind of the three things that I really think are interesting and that you brought home really well in our conversation.
Well, thank you. I feel like you summed it up amazingly. I don't think my brain could do that. So I'm impressed because I'm like, he hasn't been taking notes, but somehow he's able to like put all of this into like a succinct summary. So I'm impressed.
I tried.
You aced that, David. Yeah, I think you said it so well. And just like, figure out what you're passionate about so that you can utilize all this and go into a career that is going to be fulfilling for you. Because I think being excited to go to work, I think, is like the best aspect of life because we spend so much time working. Yes. So if you love your job, like, I think that's just a beautiful thing. Like, I'm so grateful to have found a career that energizes me, that I'm passionate about, that I'm always like, okay, what's my next project? What's my next interview on the podcast? Right. And who's my dream guest? And let me reach out, see if they say yes. So far, I've gotten a lot of no's, right? But I'm just going to keep going, right? Like, just, keep the energy up and everything. But I think you have such a great show here. So such amazing advice. And I think just great insight for people that are in grad programs or eyeing grad programs and getting themselves ready for it.
Well, thank you, Kira. Kira, so DNA Today is on any podcast platform, of course. You can find the show also on dnapodcast.com, DNA Podcast, one word. If people want to reach out to you, where's the best place to find you, to ask you questions, maybe to expand on some of the things that we covered here today?
Yeah, if you want to email me, you can email me directly at info@dnapodcast.com. There's also a contact form on the website if you just want to go right to dnapodcast.com. But I'd love to hear from you, especially if you're interested in a career in genetics. As we've talked about, like I love doing informational interviews. It certainly brings me back to those days of like early figuring out everything. So yeah, would definitely love to connect with people. And if you find genetics to be interesting, check out the show DNA Today. We've got lots of interesting interviews over the past 10 years. And I'd love your feedback too. I'm all ears.
Feedback is always good, for sure. Do you have a YouTube channel too?
Yes. If you search DNA Today, we should pop up. We're like a green logo. So yeah, we have all of our episodes on YouTube, and episodes from the past 2 years are also filmed with video. So kind of similar to what you're doing.
Great. So if you're listening, if you're watching, well, subscribe here on the YouTube channel, the Papa PhD YouTube channel. Then go to the DNA Today YouTube channel, subscribe there, and you'll get a lot of sciencey goodness going straight to your ears every week.
I love that sciencey goodness. That's a great tagline.
I've picked it up from one of the first podcasts that I listened to. It's called Twists, This Week in Science. And
yes, of course.
Dr. Kiki, she was one of my first guests. She said, I didn't think she was going to say yes. And
see, you got to put yourself out there.
See, there you go. Just confirming what you said. I didn't believe she was going to say yes, and she did. But I'm going to put all of these links that we mentioned in the show notes of this interview. Awesome. And of course, anything, if you have any questions, use the email that Kira just questions for Kira, the email that she shared. But also, I'm sharing her Twitter account, etc. And whichever is your favorite platform, feel at ease to send us questions. We might take some time to answer if we're extra busy, but it will be a pleasure for us to answer.
Yes. And I should mention that if you're interested in applying to grad school, episodes 87 and 97 of DNA Today, I think are really helpful. Those are some of our most popular episodes of the show, of just like how to successfully apply and get into grad school. So just advice from me and other students at the time. So if you're, I think your listeners will be the most interested in those episodes, 87 and 97.
Perfect. I'll add them in the show notes too. Kira, this was a great pleasure. I'm super happy that we crossed paths and that I invited you on Papa PhD. I think people will have a lot to take home from what we talked about today. And I hope they send us their comments and their questions, because it's always very appreciated. And us little independent podcasters, it's a bit rare that we get them. So
yes, anyway. I can echo that. Well, thank you so much for having me on, David. It was just such a blast. Really appreciate just being able to talk with your audience.
Same here. All the best for you and for DNA Today. And again, thanks for the work you do. I know it helps a lot of people. There you go. And now we're kind of done with the interview.
Awesome.
People are on YouTube. We're going to be here for maybe a minute or so.
Yeah.
Thanks, Kira. I'm going to end the broadcast soon. This was really great. I think... I was so happy when you said that you like to go unscripted, because that's the way I go now.
Yeah, especially like once we have a topic figured out. I just don't like going into an interview and I have no idea what the topic is. And they ask me about like vaccines or something, and I'm like, that's not my expertise. So I've certainly been in those interviews, or they're like, it's just like random stuff. I'm like, as long as I have a topic, I'm like, all right, we're on the same page. Yeah.
No. And what all you had to share was really aligned with the messaging that I kind of the messages I want to bring to the Papa PhD audience. So thank you so much.
Yeah. Oh, you're very welcome.